Hey everyone, so this is it, my thoughts on the final 3 issues. This round, by far, is the shortest we'll be covering for this series, and the sort of thing I would normally skip over. Jerry Conway was a guest writer and did more issues for the Avengers than the 3 we'll be talking about today by Mark Waid, but I skipped right over that period and maintained the decision to do so. There's just so many rounds to this thing already. We got enough going on here. But those issues by Mark Waid are distinct and important enough that they are worth talking about. First of all, unlike most other guest stints that usually only cover a couple of stories at most throughout Avengers history, Mark Waid's brief run at Avengers does cover 3 relatively independent ideas. First, the blockbuster celebratory Avengers number 400, and then number 401, which is a bit of a prelude to the Onslaught Saga, and finally, 402, which isn't much of an ending so much as another chapter in the Onslaught Saga. So maybe it's like 2.5 stories, but it's definitely worth talking about. For those that don't know, Onslaught was a being created when Professor Xavier wiped Magneto's mind. The being was only defeated when a number of key individuals in Marvel history went through this portal thing and essentially rebooted themselves into the Heroes Reborn continuity. We'll review what the Avengers were like under that time next, and we've already talked about why this was all happening a little bit last round, so for this round I'm mostly going to focus on the changes made to the series, however brief they were, for these final issues, and the quality of these final 3 issues overall. We start out with Avengers number 400. Out of these 100-issue anniversary specials, I found Avengers number 100 a little disappointing, number 200 absolutely disgusting, and number 300 a little bit frustrating because all of its cool ideas were immediately abandoned. So the Avengers, in my eyes, don't really have this strong legacy of 100-issue anniversary titles. If anything, they are kind of infamous for being bad. So number 400 out of all these 100-issue anniversary books in the original run is on balance my favorite in the whole batch. Though it abandons the more creative artwork of the Deodato days, we do get this more cartoony style that mostly works for what the series is going for. The spin-off series was brought to an end, and the Avengers were kind of brought back together and given a little bit of a reality check. I applaud and really enjoy the more experimental mood of Terry Cavanagh's Avengers, but there is something refreshing about seeing the team we know and recognize. However, digging through Avengers number 400, well, it comes down to little more than a bit of fluff. It's a fun enough book, and I certainly didn't hate reading it, but it isn't exactly my favorite Avengers book or the most memorable Avengers thing I've read for this series. Then we get into the Onslaught stuff, and my frustrations really start to build. I think I like Onslaught best when he was a character in the Marvel vs. Capcom series. The dude looks powerful and the idea behind him is cool enough for something like a fighting game, but these Onslaught books are kind of all over the place and don't really add up to much. What I find particularly odious though is the idea that after 400 books of Earth's mightiest heroes going on countless adventures, growing and changing within the industry, this series is brought to an end over a couple of tie-in issues. It gets into stuff that I had, as I've gone out of my way to note throughout grading the Avengers, started to build up in the Roger Stern days of the 1980s. By this point, tie-ins and crossover events are a big part of why I didn't like Bob Harris's run, and is the kind of thing where I felt Terry Cavanagh starts to lose a lot of people too. For this series, I tried to ignore the other issues of other series for crossover events as much as possible in grading these eras, but the industry does make that increasingly difficult, and something I'm starting to appreciate is that these events were becoming a nuisance long before the 2000s. This is a problem that's been around longer than I've been alive in the world of the comic book industry, and very much existed in the first volume of the Avengers books, where it feels like this big event essentially consumed the end of the Avengers series. So I don't particularly like these Avengers books by Mark Waid, but for the record, I don't particularly blame him or any of the artists involved in making these 3 books. They were essentially told to ramp up the series in the stupidest way possible, and did their best. But it is worth noting and remembering the presence of Mark Waid here, since, as the Avengers series would continue on in other volumes into the 2000s, Mark Waid would return in a major way going forward. We are far from done talking about this guy, who gets more rounds than any other writer in Avengers history over the course of these future Grading the Avengers episodes. He had, and still does have, this huge influence on the future of the Avengers, so by grading this initial run, however short it may be, we'll have a bit of a benchmark and reference point to compare how these books fare over his future stuff. That being said, as I've tried to make clear, this is just sort of a bit of a useful comparison, a bit of a trivial point of interest for us, because we can't blame Mark Waid too much for this era, and if anything, I believe he did the best he could given the situation that was handed to him. Mark Waid is an interesting writer who around this time was capable of delivering stuff such as the original Age of Apocalypse comics, so it's very easy to believe all this disappointment and frustration I felt when reading his 90s Avengers books, all 3 of them, doesn't really have all that much to do with Waid's abilities as a writer. Now as for the Mark Waid of the 2000s and 10s, and the Avengers he writes nearly 20 years later after these books, well, that's a very different story, and we'll get into that later. So these books are disappointing, and the whole era is basically a dud worth skipping over. It feels like that shouldn't be a huge deal, since it's only a few books we're talking about, and it has a lot to do with the industry basically imploding in on itself at the time. But I can't help but feel as though this really does leave a psychological stain on Avengers history because of where these books are placed. The first volume, which dutifully ran through good times and bad in the industry, was brought to a sudden end, not with a bang, but a truly pathetic whimper. That matters so much more to me than 3 lousy issues happening somewhere in the middle of the series. There's a cost to this that can never be fixed or taken away. Not to mention all the confusion inevitably caused by Heroes Reborn and the repeated tendency for Marvel to reboot the series that would follow in the future. It all kind of starts here, and that sucks. All that being said, it is very difficult for me to state it would have been best that none of this stuff ever happened. These moves were part of a larger series of events going on within Marvel that led to them selling off a majority of their characters' film rights to other studios. That in turn eventually led to them developing the Iron Man movie, which, as anyone watching this should know, led to the entire run of MCU movies. Though the MCU is hardly above criticism, you can't deny they haven't opened the window and gates for what movies can do in terms of adapting comics, and you certainly can't deny their success at turning so many Avengers into household names. All of that is a lot more important to me than a few embarrassing comics. Marvel didn't know they were doing it at the time, but these decisions led to some of the greatest comic book movies ever made. But of course, while I feel it is worth noting all of this, and it is worth remembering that as we move on to the Heroes Reborn era, where much of the same can be said of that time, none of it really affects my final grade. It's not in the intent of these books, and it certainly doesn't change anything about them, it's just something worth mentioning before we move on. With little meaningful content, and the Avengers generally being quite competitive when it comes to high-quality comics, this little run of books bottoms out hard in the grading scheme of Avengers, getting just about as low as one can get. While Avengers number 400 certainly had its moments, it does little to dissuade how empty, pointless, and frustrating it feels to end the series on a couple of random story beats surrounding Onslaught, who barely is even a presence in these Avengers books. This team deserves so much better than that, and instead they basically got a big old nothing burger, even with the 400th book. An empty series of comics that are only worth talking about because they basically brought a series of books to an end with little hope or premise for a return to these better days. Certainly nobody at the time could have predicted what would have come after the days of Heroes Reborn, and so all the hope and promise of the 90s trying out different things for the Avengers like they were doing in the Kavanaugh days had been killed off in favor of rebooting the entire thing under the moniker of Heroes Reborn. So next up, we go off the rails, and we go off the rails hard as we confront the infamous Heroes Reborn. But I might have some surprising opinions about that one, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time here on Comic Island.